talk about 9 Newcastle Road because that's the first place I remember. Red brick, front room, never used, always curtains drawn, picture of a horse and carriage on the wall. There's only 3 bedrooms upstairs, one in the front on the street and one in the back and one teeny little room in the middle. So I was just remembering the time when I had my hand on my mother's tit in number 1 Blomfield Road off Mather Avenue near Garston. That's when I was about 14. Took a day off school. I was always doing that and hanging out in her house. And we were lying on the bed and I was thinking, I wonder if I should do anything else, you know. And it was a strange moment. But I always think that I should have done it, presuming she would have allowed it. Hey ho.
Can't get out of my bed. There's a thought crime running through my head. Can't take these rules, and people are fools who believe what they read and believe what they see, believe what they see on the TV. Opinions are like iPhones. Everybody's got one.
Hello, welcome to episode 22 of Glass Onion on John Lennon. Now, what you just heard there was the man himself from a rather startling audio diary. He actually says the date there, September the 5th, 1979, which was during his 5 years away from the recording industry. I mean, I've been aware of this for a long time, these clips, and I think we've talked about them. I remember Kit O'Toole and I talked about them. Quite a startling admission there about him and his mother. If you're new to this podcast and joining us at episode 22, that might be a quite strange opening, but obviously I'd urge you to go back to episode 1, or at least go back 1 episode to the first part of my talk with Philip Kirkland, because today is part 2, and I'll get on to that in a second. Yeah, I've always found John Lennon's speaking voice very compelling, as well as his singing voice, of course. It's one of the reasons actually why I like Revolution 9. I mentioned that there will be an episode about that, a solo episode. Pretty sure that'll be by the end of the year. That'll be one of the next ones coming up. I do like to do a little mixture of conversations and solo episodes. So anyways, yeah, there's a sort of melancholy about John Lennon's voice, and I just can't imagine Paul or one of the others just talking that candidly. And we've discussed before, is it self-indulgence or is it honesty? There's a fine line there. So this is actually the first intro I've done since I moved to Liverpool, so I'm here until the beginning of January, and hopefully longer. Hopefully it's not going to be just a short-term thing. Just north of the centre, actually near Anfield and Goodison Park, the 2 football stadiums, even though I'm not really into football anymore, but I did take a walk down there just to have a look at them. I've also been sort of visiting a few Beatles sites. I mean, I've been to Liverpool as a visitor sort of 8 or 9 times in my life, so I've seen, Penny Lane and Mendips and all those places multiple occasions, the Cavern. I actually live quite near Kensington, the road Kensington, and 38 Kensington is where the Quarrymen made the That'll Be the Day and In Spite of All the Danger recordings. And I took a picture of the house, and quite amazing. It's just what we call in England a 2 up and 2 down, 2 rooms upstairs, 2 rooms downstairs. And David Bedford told me in our talk that was the only recording quote-unquote studio available in 1958, which is quite amazing. It was just the back room of a house. The other day I went to South Liverpool and I got the bus to Wavertree to see George's house, which I'd seen on the Magical Mystery Tour bus but never actually walked there. 12 Arnold Grove. He actually only lived there till he was 5. He lived most of his childhood in Speke, quite near Paul McCartney for a while. But amazingly small house. Again, another 2 up and 2 down, but even a small version, smaller than the Kensington one. And there were 4 children living in that house, plus the parents, so quite amazing. And then just a short bus ride, or a 20-minute walk in this case, to Childwall, which is where Brian Epstein's family home. He actually was born in Rodney Street, which is sort of Liverpool 8 area near the Art College and near what's now Lipa. But he spent a lot of his youth in his Queen's Drive, 197 Queen's Drive, and a world away from George's house. George, of course, would end up at the age of 27 in Friar Park, this enormous house with enormous gardens, and the journey from Arnold Grove to there, I mean, you can't even imagine. What else? I recently discovered another Beatles podcast called Another Kind of Mind, a fresh look at the Beatles. Unlike other people, I do actually like to plug the competition, so to speak, because I don't really see it as competition. You know, this is a John Lennon specialised podcast as opposed to a Beatles one. You know, they do a pretty deep dive on the John Lennon-Paul McCartney relationship. I know people will feel it's been done to death, but actually found some fresh perspective, so I'd recommend that one. They were kind of speaking out more for Paul and making quite a good point that a lot of people, and I've been guilty of this in the past, sort of see when John Lennon does things and says things, they're arty and mystical, and when Paul does them, they're, you know, something less complimentary. It wasn't always cool of John Lennon to sort of be a dick to people and, you know, be crude. It wasn't him being an artist, it was, you know, him just being a bit of a dick sometimes, and he's probably more guilty of that than Paul, but maybe, you know, his other excesses were greater than Paul's in some way. Anyways, yeah, I mean, the story of the Beatles is just this one long journey with endless revisionism, and I don't mean revisionism in a bad way at all. I mean, recently we found out, the last year or so, just for example, I found out that, you know, Paul took LSD in December 65 instead of sometime around autumn 66, which puts a different spin on Revolver, the fact that he had taken it by then. It's come out that George Harrison joined the Quarrymen at the end of 57 instead of sometime in 58. You know, that's not earth-shattering news, it's just of interest, I suppose, to fit the puzzle pieces together. You know, obviously the most important thing is that George joined the band, and everything transpired after that. And the other thing, Colin Hanton, who was the drummer for the Quarrymen, played on that recording, That'll Be the Day, in spite of all the danger that I was talking about earlier at Kensington. I think he's bringing out a book, or has brought out a book. He has now revealed that Paul's first gig with the Quarrymen wasn't, I think it was Clubmore Hall is the one it's supposed to be, where they're wearing the white jackets. Quite amazing picture. But apparently, I think the first gig was at Wilson Hall, which is in Garston. And apparently they also played St. Peter's Church, which is the place where they met. They played that hall with Paul, apparently. I think I got that right. You know, it just kind of goes on and on, really. As I said, a lot of it's just small details, but it's interesting to people who are into the story, you know. Endless layers. And Philip, who I talked to, of course, second part of our talk today, he found a few new things, and, you know, that's of interest as well. So going on to the talk, first of all, I have to make a little correction. At some point I say that John Lennon had 5 aunties. What she meant was that there were 5 Stanley sisters, and obviously 4 were his aunt and 1 was his mother. So Philip and I talked quite a bit about Julia Lennon and her relationship with John. And obviously that clip at the beginning was referring to that, to preface something that we talk about during the conversation. There'll be a couple more clips of that audio diary from John Lennon a bit later in the conversation as well. We branch off into other things as well, and that was one of the things I liked about this talk in particular. You know, it's good to plug the book, but talking about other things actually serves a dual purpose. It means you don't give away too much of the book. Might be of interest to readers, because obviously if you haven't read the book, then not everything we're talking about is going to make so much sense. So it's good to talk about general things. So in the first part we talked about history and a topic I really like discussing, which is like the mainstream version of events, and the fact that we should be questioning that, you know, in general. The mainstream version of the Beatles may not be as compelling or as important as the mainstream version of, you know, world wars and terrorist attacks, but it's a good habit to get into, I think, of questioning. Yeah, and we talk about other careers that John Lennon might have had as well, and him as a young man, always a compelling figure, as I've found more and more this year. So anyway, let's go to the part 2 of my talk with Philip Kirkland, and I'll be back on the other side with a few words. Enjoy. Can we move on to the Stanleys?
Sure.
Very, very interesting family. Of course, people will probably know John Lennon had 5 aunties. The oldest was Mimi, born in 1906. Julia Lennon, his mother, was born in 1914. They're sort of portrayed as chalk and cheese, and of course John was in this strange position where his aunt was acting as his mother, and his mother was acting as a kind of a carefree aunt, a sort of refuge from the mother figure. It's very strange.
Almost a sister.
As well, yeah. I mean, I guess you've seen Nowhere Boy. Yeah. I mean, a couple of people I've interviewed have sort of laid into that a little bit in terms of the details, but I think they actually agree that they got some of that right. And it's funny that when he goes out with Julia in that film, I thought the lady who played Julia did a fantastic job, and Aaron Johnson as well as John. But it's very flirty, isn't it?
Yeah.
They slept in the bed as well.
I'm not going to get into gossip, but there is a suggestion that the attraction was a little bit more than mother, son, or at least John had admitted that, but that's gossip.
It's from an audio diary thing he did in 79. He did about sort of 10 minutes, and he sounded pretty cynical and fed up with things. And he kind of said it, but honestly, I feel like as a sort of artistic guy, he just would kind of say stuff, and I don't think it's to be always taken so specifically or literally.
Yeah, that's the point. I mean, I've always said that we were discussing about, the periods of John Lennon, the Teddy Boy and the reluctant star. Because, I think in the early days he was, again, Jude put that very well in her books, that you can see that he felt he'd sold out and so on. And then the period, after he met Yoko, and getting involved in things. And one of the things I've always thought is that this getting involved in the peace movement and various other things is that John actually changed with the wind.
Yeah.
He never really knew what he stood for, I don't think.
Yeah, I think Ken McNabb and I talked about that. Even just in 69 alone, He's a funny mixture. This is what we were saying before, that he's such a compelling figure because he's two opposites at the same time. He's kind of streetwise and world-weary, but also quite naive in many ways. He would do things on a whim, and he'd probably call it an artistic whim. And I think one of the things with Yoko, because she sort of told him, look, you're an artist, think of yourself as an artist, which isn't a bad thing, I don't think. But it kind of maybe served as a sort of excuse for him to really indulge himself.
He always wanted to do what he wanted to do. And when you've reached the level of, financial security and freedom from going to work and all those things that everybody else has to put up with, you can do whatever you want to do, whether it's silly, whether it's, correct or whatever. So, I think he did it because he could do it. Yeah,
and then you factor in a sort of definitely an anger against the world, and then basically being on drugs the whole of his adult life. He said that himself. The drugs changed, but basically he said, I always need a pill to survive, and et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, what I wanted to say, with Julia Lennon, you described her as independent, carefree, played the fool, had a way with words, anti-authority, short-sighted, and didn't wear glasses. I was thinking, that sounds a bit familiar. So she's a figure, I don't know if it's possible to have a crush on someone just by reading about them. I've always thought if I'd been one of the lads, John Lennon's gang, I would have probably definitely had a crush on Julia because she's quite beautiful and very flirty.
And it's interesting to think, again, we're talking about, a mirror of the times. She appears to be like that from the moment she started working in the 1920s, from the moment she got that independence. So a woman like that at that time, I imagine there was some choice comments about her from the neighbours, if you know what I mean. Because in those times, a lady didn't act like that,
Yeah, this is a weird segue, but have you heard of the boxer Jack Johnson?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you know much about him. There's an amazing documentary called Unforgivable Blackness, and there's a book.
No, I haven't.
It's incredible. Yeah, and obviously John Lennon wrote a song called Woman is the Nigger of the World, where he was comparing the way women were treated with the way black people were treated. And Jack Johnson just did... he was a world heavyweight champion, which gave him a little bit of status and cachet. But he just did things that black guys didn't do, as far as everyone was concerned. So I suppose Julia, it must have been quite progressive, I suppose, to have a woman playing the banjo, for example, and naming her cat Elvis and things like that.
Yeah, she was definitely... Well, I say she was ahead of her time in that way, Yeah.
One thing I did want to ask you about, what was your view after your research of Alf Lennon? Because let me just tell you, obviously John put it out later that, my dad left me and, Daddy, you left me in the song and everything. And Mimi never seemed to have a good word about him. But Mark Lewison's kind of maybe revised that a little bit. So what was your impression of Alf Lennon from your research?
This is a massive point because it is the key, I think, to John Lennon's childhood. I actually have a first-hand view of this. Now, that view might be a little bit biased, but I need to start, before I answer that question, with something I found out, which was very interesting for me.
Okay.
We may get on to talk about John's uncles, and he had one uncle called Sidney, and his wife Marge, Florence Margaret, but she was known as Marge, and they had one child, Joyce. Some time ago, my friend who I mentioned earlier, Peter Hodgson, sent me a clipping from 1967, which showed John's Uncle Sidney and Aunt Ma emigrating to Canada. Joyce had already emigrated some years before. And included in the photo and the description was somebody called Paul Lennon and his wife Muriel.
Right.
Now, who is Paul Lennon? It's their son. That's what it said in the description. No, but they only have one child. They only have Joyce. Well, that's a challenge, Check the records, when was Paul Lennon? No, there is no Paul Lennon. No? Okay. So we'll come to the conclusion, possibly, that he's adopted, because he doesn't appear in any of the records. There is a 1939 register. He doesn't appear in that in the family. So, again, the detective comes into play here. I said, I'm going to find out, So Joyce is about 83 years old. So I get in touch with her daughter. Yeah, she confirmed to me that he was adopted. Mystery solved. And then a little bit longer, I'm thinking again about this, and I said, and what about Paul? He's younger. He's still around. And yeah, through a bit of very complicated detective work, found his email. And I emailed him. He was happy to talk to me. And again, that was an amazing thing, getting in touch with one of John's relatives that nobody knew existed. So anyway, to get back to your question, I sent Paul this clipping from a newspaper, and he told me, he said, I actually still have a copy of that. Yeah, I still have the newspaper. He said, for people who don't believe, I'm the cousin of John. And yeah, sure. But one thing he told me, which is going back to your question, is his father, John's Uncle Sidney, he said that he hated the books that were written about John Lennon that told this story of Alf. He's always painted as the villain in this story. I think the truth of the matter is that it was wartime. John was born in 1940. The time when Julia started, living with somebody else was at the end of the war. Alf was in the Merchant Navy, and the Merchant Navy, as much as the other forces, was part of the war effort. So Alf was doing his patriotic duty. Meanwhile, Julia wasn't, the good wife waiting at home, waiting for her husband to return. And I know from various stories that Alf wasn't the most steady character either. He spent some time in the military prison for crimes that he committed on board. So he wasn't perfect either. But to put all the blame on Alf, no, I think that's incorrect.
Right. Okay. Yeah. There's probably more to find out about that, I guess, isn't there?
Yeah, I think so. But the problem is from whom? Because the people are not around that were there at the time. That's the problem.
Yeah. Another funny coincidence. Well, funny meaning strange. They lived at 9 Newcastle Road. John lived there till he was 5. And next door at number 7 lived Sidney East, have I got that right? Who fought in the Second World War and was commemorated in the memorial. Now, was this memorial in Holland on the way? Arnhem.
Near Arnhem.
Arnhem, that's it.
I can't remember the name, but it's Oosterbroek or something like that. Well, I don't know whether he was actually commemorated there.
Okay.
It's just the fact that a story appeared in a newspaper at the time of one J. East, which I later find was Sidney. Yeah, Sidney Jacques East. I don't think he liked the idea of being called Jacques, so that's why it was always put as J, I presume. I don't know. But yeah, he lived actually next to the Stanley House at Newcastle Road. Basically, the story was there about, his adventures. But yeah, just a coincidence that he was there, and he was reported as being there in a newspaper. And I think, about 16 years later, his next door neighbour that was there, because of course at that time John was living there.
Yeah.
So yeah, just another little coincidence. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, for people who don't know, basically when the Beatles were en route to Hamburg in August '60, the first time they went to Hamburg, basically changed their life. They were pictured next to this memorial. John Lennon's not in the picture, of course. There's Alan and Beryl Williams, there's Lord Woodbine, Paul, Pete, George, who have I missed, Stuart. And of course the famous thing is that the plaque says their name liveth evermore.
Yeah.
And you've got the embryonic Beatles next to it. Quite amazing.
Yeah. The photo was taken by Barry Chang, Alan Williams' brother-in-law.
Oh, right. And we don't know why John wasn't in it, do we? Somebody said it was an early anti-war stance. Don't know if that's true.
Again, speculation. I thought for some time, actually, that he took the photo, but no, it was Barry Chang. I don't know, but I don't think he thought like that at that time.
No, I think that was a little bit of humour. It was just a book I read that said, brackets, was it an early anti-war stance? I don't know if that's true.
Well, many people say Again, speculation.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. All right, so let's go on to the story of Victoria, a.k.a. Ingrid. Amazing story. I'll just gonna say one thing and then I'll let you go with it. I first found out about this in 1998. I went to the Liverpool, I don't know what it's called now, Beatle Week, I think.
Yeah, Beatle Week now, yeah.
Yeah, is that what it's right? Yeah, because I think it probably started as like 2 days, then 3 days, then became a week. But I went, I think, 3 times. There were, great weekends, great weeks. And in 98, on the front page of The Sun, there was a picture of this Norwegian lady called Ingrid, who was John Lennon's long-lost half-sister. But could you just summarise the story, and I'll chip in a second?
Yeah, sure. While Alf was away, Julia got pregnant. The story says that it was by first of all, she mentioned that she was actually raped by a soldier. And then she actually named a soldier who, to all intents and purposes, disappeared into the mists of history and was never heard of again. Or was he? Because I did put forward a theory in the book. I did also say, don't take this too seriously. It's a possibility, but there was somebody of that name in Liverpool at that time, and it's a possibility, but that is a throwaway speculation. Like I'm always saying, don't speculate. It's a throwaway speculation. Yeah, so she was pregnant. Basically, again, given the morals of the time, she wasn't going to keep it, and the Stanley family decided that she wasn't going to keep it. They were going to send her to this home in Mossley Hill.
Salvation Army home, right?
Yeah, it was run by the Salvation Army. It was private and public. People who didn't have money and went there, they had to sort of work like slaves just to have the accommodations we looked after, to give birth and so on there, which she did. John was immediately packed off to the aforementioned Uncle Sid and Aunt Madge and Joyce in Maghull, which was well away from the action.
Yeah.
Adoption was arranged ostensibly with a friend. We assume that this was a friend of Julia, somebody called Margaret Pedersen, formerly Margaret Eden. She was married to a Norwegian officer, a naval officer called Pedersen, and they adopted her. John came back. John was never told. The interesting thing comes later, because according to Ingrid, or Victoria herself, she was named Victoria and she was called Ingrid when she was adopted. So it turns out that, in fact, Peder was actually the father.
Yeah, amazing. So the adopted father was her dad. So he had an affair with Julia, basically.
Yeah. If we look at the childhood photos of Victoria, or Ingrid, I think we call her Ingrid.
Yeah, we'll call her Ingrid, yeah.
She has a blonde, pale look, a sort of stereotypical Norwegian look. So I think it's entirely possible, no?
Right, yeah. Sort of Scandinavian look. So Julia never saw the baby, is that right? And was told that the baby had gone to Norway, but the baby was actually very close by. Was it Crosby?
Yeah, then Crosby.
It's a sort of suburb of Liverpool, yeah.
Very, very close. John actually found out first, because like I say, he never knew. He was never told. It was the Stanley family secret. I think it was around about 1964, because John was now famous and they wanted him to know before, the world knew. I think it was his Aunt Harriet who actually told him the family secret. He hires detectives to go and look in Norway and for some reason in Germany. I don't know why Germany, maybe for the name, I don't know. Maybe a German name, but no, mainly in Norway, because that's the story that was told. So he obviously wasn't told a complete correct story. First of all, I think it's going to be very difficult to find a Pedersen in Norway. I think there are Smiths in England.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Sanchez in Spain, yeah.
And of course it comes to nothing. And a couple of years after that, I think it's around 1966, that Ingrid wanted to get married and she needed her documents to get a marriage license, and she actually finds out here from the birth certificate her birth mother was Julia Lennon. There is a suspicion that she wondered why she didn't look like her parents, which kind of contradicts the fact that she did look like one of her parents. I don't know.
Yeah.
I never found out too much information about Peder. He seems to have disappeared as well. She decides that this will upset her mother because, her mother has brought her up and everything, and she won't reveal this to the world until her mother has died. Her mother dies in 1998, the very year you found out. And, of course, unfortunately, John has died 18 years before this.
Did she go public because her mother had died? Was that the agreement?
Yeah, that was the agreement to herself, I think. I think her mother never knew that she found out because, like you said, she didn't want to upset her mother. So she said, well, I'll wait until my mother's gone before I go public. According to Ingrid, she only went public, it wasn't for money, it wasn't to take advantage of the situation, it was just to let the story be known. But yeah, the thing is John and Ingrid could easily have met, and she would have expected that when her mother died, that John would still be alive, but of course he wasn't.
I've just been reading a Beatles book, actually, which is it's called Off the Record, and it's supposed to be kind of stuff they said in interviews that wasn't so publicised. And when a reporter asks him about Alf in 1965, which is actually a year after he became aware of Alf again, he said something like, I've got relatives crawling out the woodwork. So he may not have been only referring to Alf. So slightly corroborate the fact that he found out in 1964, yeah. So I guess the end of that story is that she turned up at Mendit's, Menlove Avenue, 8th of December 2000, when the blue plaque was put there. And did she meet the family? They're obviously aware of her.
I quoted Julia Baird, John's half-sister, in the book. So it's a direct quotation. I'm not going to interpret that to my own ends because Julia can tell her own story. So yeah, apparently she did meet, and she wanted to meet Yoko and Sean as well, which she did.
All right. Obviously, we could talk about all the stories in the book, but we want people to buy the book. There was one that I did want to talk about. I mean, this is pretty tragic stuff, definitely. Yeah. You were saying earlier you took a quote from Agatha Christie. Just tell us that again, because I didn't know that quote.
Yeah, this story, I think it has to be told because it's new information, but again, we are involving people of the family that are still involved. So yeah, I want to be very careful what I say in this story. But there was a play or a book by Agatha Christie called 3-Act Tragedy, and this refers to a 4-act tragedy in the fact that 4 people, all closely related, all died in a violent way.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, one of the downsides of fame and fortune, and of course this doesn't apply to the family, they are by no means, hyper famous and hyper rich. Unfortunately, because of the association with somebody in that situation, it comes out sooner or later. Every little story comes out of the woodwork. So
yeah, as you were saying earlier, everyone wants to know about the Beatles in minutiae.
Yeah,
more than anyone else. I mean, I think the thing I would like to point out, I think sort of hardcore Beatles fans would probably know this already, especially if they read Tune In. But we just want to smash the myth that the off-duty policeman who ran over Julia on July the 15th, 1958, the myth was that he was drunk. And again, John was told this. But what in fact happened was June 21st, which is, 3 weeks earlier, John Dykins, who was Julia's lover, they call it common law husband, not official husband, but they were in a stable relationship. He mounted the central reservation of Menlove Avenue. Menlove Avenue is a dual carriageway. And he was actually represented, another weird coincidence, by Rex Makin, who was the Epstein's lawyer.
Twitchy, Bobby Dykins, her second husband. I don't know if she ever married him or not. Sleazy little waiter with the nervous cough and the thinning margarine-coated hair. He used to always push his hand in the margarine or the butter and grease his hair with it before he left. He used to keep his tips in a big tin on top of a cupboard in the kitchen where I used to always steal them. That's the least they could do for me.
And he was banned from driving. And, I mean, you make the point in the book that because he was banned from driving, Julia had to take the bus and she was on her way to the bus stop when she killed. But I don't think you weren't saying that John Dykins was responsible in that sense, were you? I mean, it's just a circumstance, right?
It's a possibility now. Maybe John Dykins would have been doing something else and she would have taken public transport anyway, but it's a possibility now.
Yeah, but I think the thing with these things, I mean, you know the story of Nigel Wally was obviously walked with, and I just saw a film, fairly new one with David Bedford in it called Looking for Lennon, which is a quite familiar story to a lot of people, but it's got some good footage. And you've got Nigel Wally actually walking along Menlove Avenue just like last year, I think, or 2017. And he was, of course, talking to Julia, and then he said, cheerio, and then he heard the brakes go and then saw her body flying through the air. Now, of course, he was haunted for years. if he talked to her for 5 more seconds, 10 more seconds, that wouldn't have happened. So
I think what happens here is what always happens is that, it's a massive loss for your family and people try to apportion blame to somebody.
Yeah, I mean, that seems to be human nature,
Apparently John wouldn't speak to Nigel for a long time after that.
That's right,
Because, it's easy to blame Nigel for not keeping her talking or whatever. I mean, how would he ever know what was going to happen next, So, but he's going to apportion blame to Nigel for, it's your fault, because you should have kept her talking or whatever, which is ridiculous.
Well, let's just put to bed the thing about the policeman being drunk anyway. So he wasn't. He was a learner driver. He claims he wasn't speeding either. He said Julia wasn't looking, etc. So, I mean, obviously a horrible freak accident. So John Lennon, go on, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, according to the court records, no, there is no mention of him being drunk. But again, I think this was the anger of Mimi, the anger of John. Of course, that story gets put about. I can actually make a comparison with this, that I live in Mexico. You can imagine in Mexico City, the driving is pretty mad at times.
Right, yeah.
In many of these big cities. I actually got my driver's license here by just filling in forms and giving money. That's the process. Of course, I had a British driver's license, but I didn't have to prove that I could drive or even that I could see, So there are a lot of people on the road that are not really qualified to drive. Let's say somebody steps out into the road and I knock that person down and I injure that person. I am immediately the villain.
Yeah, you're sort of culpable in the sense that you caused it, whether or not you were doing something wrong.
And the fact that with somebody on a bike, there's a lot of people on bikes disregard the rules of the road. They go the wrong way down one-way street. They go around corners into another one-way street and stuff like that. If I knock that cyclist off, then I'm to blame. And then in other situations, people have almost been lynched. And if it's a child, maybe the child's mother wasn't taking care of the child, wasn't holding the hand. Maybe the child ran into the street. But God forbid that you run that child over, I think that's the same situation. Because if you run that child over, then you are an absolute animal. You are a criminal. Even if you were driving at a normal speed, even if that child ran into the street out of control, etc. So I think this is the situation, is that the anger, being angry, there's no logic involved, you blame whoever you can. So I think that's what happens here.
Yeah. I mean, I've never had anything as awful as that ever happen to me, so I really don't want to judge. But, the 4-act tragedy, obviously, John died violently December 1980. So John, his mother, died violently. Bobby Dykins hit a lamppost in his car, is that right? June 66.
Yeah.
And then his mother was attacked in her home. Do we know why that happened? Was that a freak thing?
It was, according to this, a young man who was responsible for that. He took medication which changed his character or something. Or that was a judgment. Extenuating circumstances, I think they call it now. But anyway, he served time, obviously, because it was an attack. It wasn't a premeditated murder. It was an attack on an old lady of 80-something. Because of the injuries, she then died from those injuries. So what was immediately... was in the first place, an attack, suddenly became a murder or a manslaughter, I suppose. Yeah. So the coincidence that, that family suffered in that way is quite incredible.
I mean, there's an air of tragedy around the Beatles. I mean, I imagine you've probably heard something about the Beatles podcast. When it was Richard Buskin and Robert Rodriguez together, I thought they were a dynamite team. They had great topics for their podcast. They did one called Death and the Beatles, and it was incredible how much premature death was involved with that band.
Well, of course, John was the last of these four to go.
Well, it's funny, when you were talking about the mother being attacked, it flashed through my head what happened to George Harrison. I mean, I don't know what that guy was intending when he went into the house, but I think he was on antidepressant drugs or something.
Well, actually, in this case of John Dykins' mother, I mean, it was... Or the four, it was mother, son. Oh,
yeah.
That's strange,
Yeah, very strange.
As I've said all the way through this, is that there are stories to be told which are not directly related to John, not directly related to the Beatles, but they are interesting stories. They are sensitive stories, I know. But like I say, they will be told sooner or later, so you have to say, well, if I've got the facts, why not tell it, And like I've also said before, you do your best. Some people will like it. you'll always get your critics. Any artistic enterprise, whether it be, a singer, a painter, a writer, is always going to get criticism. So.
Yeah. And the thing about sort of having an interest in John Lennon and that spinning off into other things, I mean, that's happened with me my whole life. Yeah. I mean, I quite like Shakespeare now. I probably know maybe 10 of his plays reasonably well. And surprise, surprise, one of the reasons was the end of I Am the Walrus, when there's the excerpt from King Lear, and suddenly all those famous lines, sit you down, father, rest you, and serviceable villain. When you're a huge fan, these things just resonate, especially when you're a kid as well.
That also says a lot about John, though, about his literary side.
Yeah, I just found, I got into Alice in Wonderland because of him. Not that I maybe wouldn't have got into it anyway, but that it's just such a compelling story that I think the thing is with John is that, it's well known that he hated school, that he messed about in school, that he never amounted to anything in school. But John was one hell of an intelligent boy. Yeah.
And became a very intelligent man. He was very well read. That is something that's very important to know about John. It's like a lot of people, though, that sometimes we know people from school. If you were that philosophical at the time you were actually at school, you'd say, this guy's going to be successful, this one's going to have an absolute failure of a life. And then when you get to our age, or even my age, you suddenly realise that those who messed about in school and weren't academic and weren't interested were much more successful than many of those who were, top of the class.
Yeah, I think sometimes, but it was interesting at our class, at my school, we had two guys, we all used to live in the same area, so we used to walk to and from school a lot. And these two guys used to clash because one of them was not particularly, I don't think had any particularly original ideas, but he played the game. And he was very successful. And the other one was a complete opposite. His name was Anthony Harris. I remember at school, he used to write these stories, and we were like, and looking back, although I didn't know much about John Lennon, now I look in retrospect, he was a bit of a John Lennon, like a mind, and it kind of went south for him, unfortunately. He couldn't really fit in. I don't know what he's doing now, but the last time I saw him, it wasn't going so well because he couldn't really fit into mainstream society. John passed his 11 plus because I think the quote he said was that he was terrified of not having anything, so he buckled down and passed the 11 plus, and then just slowly went down and down. But I also became a bookworm because of him, basically. I mean, in Jude's book, which I read recently, he's just reading constantly, and I'm the same. I just carry a book around everywhere I go, and it's, he's inspired me to be like that.
Yeah, I think John would have made it in something. Although when he was younger, he liked to take life as it came, and he was anti-establishment, anti-authority. There was enough intelligence there and enough innate ability. Could he have been an artist? Could he have been a writer? Well, he was a writer, wasn't he?
Yeah.
He could have made a career of any of those things. I
could see him as a sort of a Gerald Scarfe, drawing those cartoons. I think Gerald Scarfe, if I'm right, collaborated with Pink Floyd on the Wall film. So I could see John Lennon doing that. Because actually, if you look at some of the footage of Imagine, and I've read this as well, he had a professional side as well. And he had a practical side. Mimi instilled in him hard work and stuff. There's a famous BBC interview when they said, do you think you would have been published with your book if you weren't a Beatle? And he said, well, if I wasn't a Beatle, I would have been crawling around broke.
That was a good accent.
Oh, thank you. I went to drama school many years ago.
I don't know. I don't think that's true. I mean, he would have done something artistic.
Yeah.
We mentioned Bill Popjoy, the headmaster at Quarrybank in his final year, and apparently he said to Mimi, Mrs. Smith, your son is a bohemian. Popjoy's methods were people who are not academically inclined, even if they're intelligent, if they have some interest, encourage it.
Yeah.
Because everybody's going to do something, Not everybody's going to, become a doctor or get a degree at university or whatever, but everybody has some value. Everybody has some talent they can use. They may not use it. A lot of people go through life from job to job and never amount to anything, even though they have the talent. Another reason why I think he's a very important figure, Bill Popjoy, because he did encourage it, When somebody has innate artistic ability in many areas, like John did, then he would have done something.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. I think we've already done 2 hours, so I'm going to reluctantly draw this to a close, but the rest of the book really is about the early Quarrymen, isn't it? Sort of 59, 60. I think that will...
At the beginning of the Beatles, yeah.
At the beginning of the Beatles, yeah, of course. Yeah. I think that will be pretty accessible, I think that is the word I'd use, to John Lennon fans. Do you want to just pick one story from there before we finish?
Yeah. First of all, that was in my mind that not everybody is interested in the ancient history. There are all kinds of Beatles fans. There are the ones that are interested in the music, and that's it. I like the music. I'm not really interested in everything else that goes with it. There are those who are interested in the early history. There are probably fewer less that are interested in the ancient history, the ancestry, although for me that's very, very interesting. That quote that you quoted earlier about, being part of our ancestors and so on. But yeah, I recognise that the further back I go, the less some people are interested. So the more recent stuff like John's childhood, which is covered pretty well with those stories you mentioned, and of course the actual beginnings of the group, it's not chronological, it's not a story of this happened and this happened and this happened. What I was doing there again was picking out particular stories. For me, what is very interesting is I think there are 3 key points possibly.
Okay.
One is Hamburg, because Hamburg, that made them into one hell of a tight group. But before that, there were 2 others now, the Casbah.
Yep.
Because without the Casbah, again, for people who don't already know, you can read why. Without the Casbah, without Mona Best, and I know that the Best family tells everybody this, and they have, good reason to do so in many ways, that without the Casbah, there wouldn't have been any Beatles, because the Beatles were basically falling apart then. George Harrison was playing with another group because there weren't any gigs with the Beatles, or the Quarrymen, or whatever they would call themselves at the time. So that was important too. Turning point, if you like. They got regular gigs, so they got back together again. And the third one, which is I do in quite a bit of detail in the book, is the Scotland tour in 1960.
Yeah, what I love about that, I'll let you carry on in a sec, but the other thing about the Beatles is there's always eccentricity, and the Scottish tour was organised by a local pig farmer. Is that right?
Yeah, well, he was a promoter, but that was his day job, yeah.
I know, I don't mean to belittle him at all, but I just thought it was funny. It was one of those funny details. And when Johnny Gentle crashed the van, fans will know that's a famous story. They'd just been to the pig farm and had bacon and eggs and stout. I just thought that was a nice little detail.
I think was, yeah. You say one story, for me, one fascinating story that comes out of this, and again, this isn't completely conclusive, but there's been a lot of argument about when were they Beatles, when were they Silver Beatles, and so on. There are 2 events related to this, which is that when Johnny Gentle did crash the van, Tommy Moore, the drummer at that time, was on that tour to be taken to hospital. I think possibly they had to wait for insurance, and I don't know, all sorts of things. So they were delayed. This was in Banff in Scotland, so some local girls starstruck. Obviously these guys were nobody, Paul Ramon and Carl Harrison, and, as they were calling themselves. They were nobodies as far as they were concerned, but they saw like a minibus with posters for gigs on, and they said, this must be something famous. I'm not sure even Johnny Gentle was known there. Maybe it could be for that. But anyway, they got autographs and everybody signed. A couple of things come out of that, which is really interesting. One is that people say that John Lennon didn't change his name. He did actually sign Johnny.
Johnny Lennon, yeah.
So Johnny Lennon, not Long John and the Silver Beatles. Whether that's true or not, I think we still don't know. But he did sign himself Johnny Lennon, or Johnny, whatever. And the other thing is that I think it was Stuart signed, or no, I think it was Paul that signed, and he put underneath the Beatles.
All right.
Now, according to some accounts, they weren't the Beatles until they went to Hamburg, or just before they went to Hamburg. And then shortly coming back from this tour, there is a gig at, I think it's Neston on the Wirral, and there is a report of that. This is just shortly, I think it might even be the first gig, I can't remember exactly, but it's just shortly after the Scotland tour. So we're talking first days of June 1960, and they are advertising the entertainment at Neston. Again, it mentions the Beatles, and fully formed with an A, Beatles with an A. So, it's,
yeah.
This is something which actually comes out of the research a lot, that you thought something, and then you get the evidence. Those are wonderful to find those bits of evidence. Say, no, then it must have been before this, and so on. So, yeah, that's the interesting thing.
Yeah, and David Bedford was talking about how important that tour was. It's just that kind of earthiness, that kind of starting from nothing. Because didn't you say that they gave those autographs in return for a bag of chips or something?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it?
Yeah, I think one of the girls went to buy them chips.
Yeah. But it's the idea of them starting from nothing, because there's those horrible home tapes as well. Some of them are quite good, but I think it's 2 recordings, and there's some horrible 12-bar instrumentals. That was just before they went to Hamburg, so just on the cusp, you know?
And actually, there was another story that came out of the Scotland tour. Sorry.
No, that's all right. Go for it.
The last story.
Okay.
In one of the venues, one of the support bands, the bass player played a Hofner violin bass.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
It didn't actually look like Paul's. I've actually seen photos. I mean, it looked like it, but it didn't have I think Paul's has a scratch. I'm not an expert on these things, but it has a scratch plate, the white scratch plate. And this one was it looked like a violin, you know, it looked completely dark. An earlier model, I suppose, Hofner violin bass. Of course, it was unusual for its shape, as I think Paul's was. And apparently Paul did chat with this guy about this. Of course, at this point, Paul wasn't even playing bass.
Oh, yeah, of course, 61 he started playing bass. That's right.
Yeah, so it might well have been a catalyst or something that jogged his mind later, you know, when he was playing regularly, that he had remembered this bass and he was attracted by it, you know, because he bought the first one in Germany, I believe, you know.
Yeah, that's right. He did say in one interview that when his dad was showing him piano stuff back in the 50s, he was quite fascinated with the bass, like walking bass and things. So that would have influenced his playing.
There was this time in the Casbah, wasn't there, that they didn't have a bass player and he strung his guitar with piano chords or something.
Oh, that's right. When they broke a string, it was either his or Stu's, I can't remember, but yeah, they take a string out of the piano. I mean, he was playing bass, piano, and drums at different times, and guitar with the band.
This picture in the Casbah is with George smiling behind and in front of the cobweb and everything. It's actually his. I can't remember the model. Like I say, I'm not hot on the instruments. The red, I think the red model. I don't know. It was the second guitar he had. You probably know more than me about that.
Maybe not. No. I don't know.
But anyway, it actually is a guitar. It's not a bass.
Oh, okay.
So what he's done is he's taken piano strings and strung just 3 of them, I think, 3 or 4 of them, on a guitar, not a bass guitar, on a guitar that he was using before.
Yeah, they had to. Again, they.
So didn't the Casbah, yeah.
Well, they just celebrated the 60th anniversary of the Casbah, actually. Yeah. It was the end of August, I think. Okay. I wanted to say, actually, when you were talking earlier, your book isn't strictly chronological, but I did find towards the end it was more recent history. So what I would say to readers, I find this a lot with books. Like if I read, for example, a biography of somebody, the childhood is maybe not always the exciting part that you're waiting for. But you read through that and then you get to might be the juicy bits. I don't know. But what I would say to listeners, and hopefully you're going to read your book, is that the early history is important. And it might not be as accessible to, say, Beatles fans or John Lennon fans, like you said, who aren't so into history, for example. Yeah. But it's worth reading through it because then you it's almost like a reward, isn't it? So later on in the book, you get stuff that's more familiar, more accessible. Is that a good argument?
It's a reward finding the information. But for me, a lot of people have told me, they said, I always like to find anything new. So, I can confidently say they definitely will. Maybe if they've been listening to this podcast, maybe they've learned a few new things already.
Yeah. I might have to edit it a little bit because I feel like we've given away quite a lot.
No, there's plenty more in there.
Yeah, there is.
It's worth the money.
Yeah, all right.
Go to Amazon, type in All Roads Lead to Lennon, and you can buy it in your local store. Free delivery in the UK, by the way. Okay.
Are there other outlets? Is it all the usual outlets as well as Amazon?
Just on Amazon.
Oh, just on Amazon. Okay, perfect.
Until somebody mentions that they bought it, and I might hear in the future that somebody's stocking it, but at the moment, just directly from Amazon.
Okay. A little bird told me you're going to be appearing on Jude's show at some point.
I have been invited. Oh. I don't know.
You should do it. She's a force. She's a force of nature. That lady.
I haven't been confirmed, but I was invited some months ago.
Yeah. Yeah. I've got more of a sort of relaxed style than she has. She's very, very dynamic, but she was on my show and we had a great time. She speaks with such passion and she got such energy. So.
And the southern lady, you know? The accent.
Yeah, she hates the accent. She's been trying to get rid of it, but I loved it. Like, I've never had a conversation with someone with an accent like that for at least for 2 hours.
I just want to mention two people, you know, who haven't read the book or haven't even seen the cover, but Jude did in fact do the foreword to the book.
That's right.
And the prologue, which was a great pleasure for me, was done by Helen Anderson.
Yep.
For those who don't know, Helen Anderson was, along with Bill Harry and Stuart Sutcliffe and Thelma Pickles and so on, they were colleagues at the Liverpool Art College at the same time.
Yep.
So Helen has a first-hand knowledge of those times, which is fantastic to find somebody like that. She is regularly in contact with me with things not related to research, so I feel like I've made a friend.
Oh, excellent, yeah. I found doing this podcast this year, I've kind of got into the Beatles family, the 21st century Beatles family, and they're all very friendly. You know, it's amazing, really. She's actually in this documentary I've just seen called Looking for Lennon. Just a quick plug for that. I'm nothing to do with it. It's a very good documentary.
Helen also is famous for the leather hats, those very distinctive leather hats that John used.
Oh, yeah, like the Dylan style.
Yeah, because she went into design. She painted as well, but she did designs for some famous stores. I can't remember which one, Saks, I think, and Harrods or something. I don't know, but they were top-end stores. She spent her career designing, and she is still designing. She is a very young... I mean, obviously we don't give away the age of a lady, but she, of course, is a little bit younger than John Lennon. But she is the youngest person of that age that I know, you know.
Oh, like young in spirit, you mean?
Young in spirit, young in love. Young in everything. Yeah. All
right, excellent. All right, well, thanks for doing this. Stay on the line for a sec. I'll just do the official goodbye now. And, good luck with the book, and I'm sure I'll be in touch in the future.
Okay, thank you.
All right, you're welcome. Bye.
Bye-bye.
So there you have it. Hope you enjoyed that. I'm going to make this outro very short since the intro seemed to be getting longer and longer. Please, 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 please leave a rating on iTunes, aka Apple Podcasts. If you just go to the store and hopefully click on the 5th star, or at least the 4th one. And there is a reason for this. It's not just so I can go and look at people rating me. As you can imagine, there's loads and loads of podcasts out there. And even though I seem to have the only one that's specifically about John Lennon, you still need a certain amount of ratings and hopefully reviews as well. If you feel like leaving a short review, go ahead. For people to be aware of the podcast, to get it up the browsing list, because otherwise no one's going to know about it, so it won't matter how good it is. Probably said that last time, so apologies for repeating myself. But it's very important. The other things you can do, Facebook page is Facebook.com/glassonionjlpod, and the Twitter handle is @onion with capital O and Lennon with a capital L. We're on all the major podcast platforms, Spotify, etc., Stitcher, Podbean. So just say the next few episodes that are coming out, I'm not sure of the order yet, but I will be reviewing one or both of the Imagine films. I'm sure I've already mentioned this, but certainly we'll be reviewing the 1988 film, and that will be with someone who has a film podcast, so they know what they're talking about. I'm also trying to cajole a member of my family into doing a podcast with me, but well, we'll see how that goes. I'm not going to commit myself to that. And like I said, before the end of the year, we'll do one about Revolution 9. There may be other ones in the interim. You know, this podcast takes a long time to edit. I mean, research-wise, I kind of feel like I've already got the knowledge, really. So I'm not going to pretend I spend hours and hours rereading books. Obviously, if I've got a guest who's got a new book, I'll read that quite carefully and make notes and everything, but I don't really consider that work. Obviously, I do internet research to supplement it. Really, it's the editing's a bit of a killer and putting all these sound clips and everything, but not complaining, of course, my choice. But if you could give any support to the show, not monetary, I'm not monetizing whatsoever, but just sharing links, etc., like, follow, subscribe, and all that good stuff. Alright, here comes the music, and I'll see you very soon. Thanks very much for listening. All the best. Bye.
course, the bagpipes got me right back to Edinburgh, which is one of my favorite dreams. The Edinburgh Festival and the tattoo in the castle when all the bands of the world's armies would come and march and play. And I always remember feeling very emotional about it, especially when they did the bit at the end where they put all the lights out and there's just one guy playing the bagpipes, lit by a lone spotlight. I always felt free in Scotland. It's probably the same feeling I get in Japan, actually. It's the feeling of being in a foreign country, and therefore you don't have to deal with the social mores so much, free from everything. It's easier to be yourself in a foreign country. I think that's why so many people go crackers when they get on holidays in those places. The freedom's too much for them. Well, I'm sitting here waiting to be taken out to view yet another group of houses for our country retreat. This endless search for Scotland outside of New York, within an hour of New York. It's easier to think than talk.